Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Joni Thompson. I'm a producer with Blue Cadet.
I am Ben Boyk. I'm the tech director at Blue Cadet.
And I'm Dave Holland. So I've been the head of the creative unit at the Royal Ontario Museum for 18 and a half years, and before that, 20 years with a architectural consulting practice that specialized in planning and design for museums. And our team at the ROM creates all of the exhibition design and does we're the producers of all of the multimedia. So that's either by means of doing it in-house and with other partners, such as our web team, or by hiring outside specialist consultants such as Blue Cadet. And I have an abiding interest in how to make museum content engaging and memorable across all kinds of visitors, and that's something that we feel we're still learning how to do every day.
So today we're going to be talking about this theme of institutional bravery and what it means to take risks in this component of a larger exhibit. So we're doing that through a case study about this component of the exhibit, talking about what it means to take risks, trusting in partnership, investing in process, and then creative and different ways of measuring success and what that will look like. So we're going to start by introducing our two organizations and sort of talking a little bit about how the collaboration came to be. Dave is going to walk us through some of the context for the exhibit, which was such an essential part of the governing tone. And then we're going to talk about process. We're going to talk about the delicate balance of science versus play and sort of what chord we struck there. And then we're going to talk about some overall takeaways about this component of the exhibition. So we'll start.
Apologies in advance for the terrible puns.
So just for those who may not be familiar, the Royal Ontario Museum, affectionately known as the ROM in Toronto, it's encyclopedic in its breadth of content. We are currently branding it as a museum of art, culture, and nature. And you see here some recent of our feature exhibitions. There was the installation of Dale Chihuly's art there that you see on the upper left. Our Ancient Pompeii show. There's one of our Earth and Space mineral galleries, Forbidden City. In the middle bottom there, you see our Life in Crisis gallery. So we think of ourselves as being mission-driven. We have a number of we have some explicitly stated mission elements and some that are working policies or practices. One of them is to be an advocate for nature. And so this is actually the Life in Crisis gallery. So we talk about endangered species, and we talk about protecting habitats in order to preserve animals, flora, and fauna. And we're also, one of the things that we don't explicitly state, but the staff has been tasked with doing, is to be surprising and alive. And so for a kind of fusty, old, very traditional, classic kind of museum, we are always trying to think of ways of bringing things to life. And so this, what you see there in the lower right, is our traveling exhibition, Ultimate Dinosaurs, where we brought the specimens to life using augmented reality. So we had things like iPad viewers that you could hold up to the specimens, and it would actually put the skin on the dinosaur and animate it and make it roar and give you fun facts about it and so on. So people think of us as a kind of a little bit the Met, a little bit the MoMA, and a little bit the American Museum of Natural History in terms of our scope.
Quick sound check. Can everyone hear in the back? I just want to make sure we're good. Okay, great.
Excellent. All right, Joni and I are from Blue Cadet. Blue Cadet is based in Philly and New York. The two of us are actually in the New York office that opened 2 years ago. And we're going to be taking on the point of view of the vendor in this presentation. And Blue Cadet in general, we would say, is an experience design studio, and we partner with mission-driven organizations like the ROM, other institutions, cultural institutions, and we create a wide range of products. Started with doing interactive touch screens at museums and have expanded to doing anything that involves design, technology, and content. And what we try to do with our exhibits is always try to build some sort of empathy from the visitor to the content that we're trying to teach them. Here are some of the examples are on the left from the National Air and Space Museum, where we did a whole suite of the website, the mobile app, and a giant touch wall where you could explore the entire collection and try to make connections between a toothbrush that 2 astronauts would share and a Saturn V rocket. So having sort of a wide range of context there. And then on the top right is an example of a gallery that we activated at the Institute of Art in Chicago. And that was for the Van Gogh exhibit, where you could look at the same painting that he did over various points in time with different perspectives on it and analyze that. And on the bottom right is an example of video production that we do. So it's kind of spanning the whole gamut from doing web, mobile, big interactives, activating spaces, and trying to build some sort of storytelling element into the content that we're trying to teach people.
So this is the actual reveal moment in the exhibition proper, where you see the skeleton of what is the largest animal ever to have lived on the planet. And one of the points we make is that when people ask us, what, even bigger than a dinosaur? Yes, actually, and there are many ways to find out exactly how they're bigger than the dinosaurs ever were. And so I'm going to just help you understand the bigger backstory here. And so the first experience in the exhibition is an immersive film experience. So these are visitors standing in a room where the 3 walls of the room are large-scale animated projections. And we're actually going to show you that film. And the importance of doing this here in today's session is that we did focus group research and found that the story that you see playing out here was something that was the most magnetic, other than the fact of being able to see this very impressive skeleton. Absolutely next to that was how compelling this story was. And we were quite surprised at how this was picked up in the media worldwide and for a fairly sustained period of time, and even inspired a sketch on Saturday Night Live where there was an exploding dead whale. So here, we're just going to play it for you. Everyone read the type? Yeah. So imagine subwoofers in the floor. People have been writing me saying that they cried every time they watched this.
In Newfoundland, they're facing a dilemma over wildlife too. What to do with 2 washed-up blue whales.
But rather than let this creature decompose on its own and wither away, there's a plan to recover the remains for the benefit of Canadians.
We had the benefit of this footage through a partnership that we have with a college program called Environmental Communication. These are students that go into the field and capture environmental related events. And one of the benefits of being in the field and one of the two whales actually turning up in a place where it was largely still immersed in cold water where it beached is that we were able to collect viable tissue samples for enabling a DNA analysis to create the complete world's first genome of the blue whale. And in addition, we're able to collect one of the hearts of the two whales intact and sent that off to Grubenplastinate in Germany. Those are the folks that do the Body Worlds exhibition. So this is the largest organ they've ever prepared. So we had a show with 2 objects in it. So what you see here is something that we did at the outset and then something a little further along. And so the team at the ROM, before we engaged Blue Cadet, started by setting out very clear learning objectives and together with that, a set of experience goals. So we were really focused on what we wanted to be happening in terms of learning outcomes for the visitors, but really what was that arc of the narrative? What was that emotional journey that you might be taken along? We really wanted to help people understand through the sort of magic moment of this, how awesome the creature is, to learning more about it, it's intriguing, and on that journey have you come out the other end really with feeling quite empathetic about them to the point where you would actually care about the conservation effort made for blue whales. So this is a word cloud exercise that the team did. We put a lot of stakeholders in the room, including some senior management staff, marketing people, ROM teachers, a real spectrum of stakeholders. And interestingly enough, we were able to settle on the high points here of the word cloud quite quickly and with a lot of consensus. And we found even in some of the reporting that we're seeing in the newspaper articles and online press that these kind of words here that you see at the top level were the ones that were being used actually in headlines, so that we felt that we had accomplished, driving you to having these kind of ends. What you see on the right there is an exercise further down where we're saying, okay, we have 2 objects in the show, we have all these ideas, all this content, how are we going to get them across? And we came up with something that the team came to call the cool stuff list. So this was a bunch of possibilities. We only had a fixed budget, as we always do, and we left ourselves open to the possibility of spending that money variously across all of these ideas and deciding which things we would ramp up, which things we would do kind of lo-fi. And so the game, of course, is something where we put some real investment in. And so you see here, there's the thing about feeding babies. Well, we had all kinds of crazy ideas about how much mother's milk a baby whale might drink over the course of a day. And we ended up doing a fairly low-tech thing, which was a gargantuan model of a milk carton. So you could see just at a glance how much milk that truly was. And then you see here further down the list, there's a thing called lunge feeding video. And we had an anatomist on the team, one of our curatorial reps, who was just so passionate about how uniquely adapted whales are, and the fact that blue whales don't breach, they don't go jumping out of the water like other kinds of whales species, but they have this particular way of behaving when they go down to eat, and that's what you're going to see here in the detail of the gameplay. And she was really keen to make sure that visitors would come out of it understanding this really cool thing that whales do when they feed. And so we thought of it initially as a video, and the point I want to make here is we kept ourselves open to the possibility of each of these things turning into something of different kinds, so that we left the means of expression quite open. This is a mood board that we used in our focus research, and shows you the basic layout of the plan. The idea was that we would put the skeleton right centrally, physically centrally located and conceptually centrally located, so that as you went through the exhibition, you would never be able to lose sight of it, that you would always feel its presence, and that there would be this kind of kit of parts, an underwater feel with these kind of bubbles, and without a strict hierarchy of information, which we are typically doing in an exhibition setting. But we came up with this bunch of parts, all of which were more or less equal one to the other. And that gave us this fluidity, this flexibility to develop and put ideas wherever they seemed to best fall for a whole variety of logistical and cost and time reasons.
I'll go back
Yeah, let's go back to the plan. So there's the whale skeleton in the center. It's about 80 feet long. And then these other topics, and arranged in such a way, excuse me, that it's fairly organic how you can go about them. There's really a kind of flow to ensure that people went through and had a good chance to see everything, but you could really bop around and do things in any order that suited you. And so that kind of free flow of both the information and the actual physical experience is something that was very deliberate. And so we set about to organize our thinking along two lines. One is what were the main points that had to be accomplished through this particular activity, and then secondly, what the nature of the experience would be. And here's in the point in our process where we decided we actually wanted to highlight a number of the experiences so that they would truly be remarkable, and by that I mean something that would generate word of mouth. And so we put out an RFP to media design companies, to vendors, and gave them our basic content points. And so here you see, these are the kind of things that we were very keen to get across. There's that whole thing that the one curator was really interested in, is the fact that the blue whale does something really weird. Imagine you have to go down and get your food really, really deep in the water, but they're mammals just like you and I. They have to come back up for air, and so they have to do it without getting the bends. And there's this strange thing that happens where they have these special muscles that contract the rib cage that forces oxygen out of their lungs, and it's a kind of scientific way of ensuring that they can go down and come back up in a way without getting the bends. And so we imagined all these kind of ways where you could see inside of a whale and empathetically kind of be a whale and have to accomplish this end. And then on the interactive side, we really wanted to talk about the nature of the experience in the most general way without actually being quite prescriptive. And so I hate this expression, wow moment. We're always being asked by our senior managers to ensure we have a few of those. And but we really wanted something that would stand out. And so this is one, it's certainly one of the most popular aspects of the exhibition, and something that you'll see at the end when we talk about our measures of success. But these are the things that we wanted to, in the general sense, achieve.
So we're going to talk a little bit about now that we were engaged with the RUM and Blue Cadet was coming in to work on this specific part, talking a little bit about our process. So the idea of why we came to it being a game, the goal of that was generally to reinforce these key content points that the ROM team had identified. The idea that games have wide appeal, people like them. The idea that it's a familiar paradigm, that people more or less know what to do when they see sort of the indicators and prompts, and it's something people feel comfortable jumping right in and participating in. The potential.
But what you need to know is that in our traditional museum setting, we would have senior staff saying, yeah, that sounds like a kind of thing they do at the science center.
Right. So so balancing that, obviously, with the need for it to not feel like it's trivializing any of the scientific components, the potential for fun, and then the idea that you don't see games that often in a gallery space. So it's this variation in what visitors are used to seeing when they're going to an exhibition. So this is when we are looking at a project like this is our general framework for how we come up with our final concept. It's definitely a framework and not a prescriptive formula, but it's a guideline that really helps us get to this rough concept. So the first component are these key content points, and we were very fortunate going into this engagement with the ROM that they had done a lot of this work ahead of time, which is very helpful for us coming in, that they as a group were more or less in alignment about these key areas of teaching. And so a big part of what we did, and we do this a lot in our work, is interpreting that, digesting that, and then rephrasing it and sort of making sure that we're all on the same page. So this is our variation of sort of embodying what's implied by the initial content points ROM had given to us. So again, it's this feast to famine pattern of how whales dive and feed, and the dire circumstances, which was their need calories. morphology and adaptations, which goes along with the motion and mechanics and the really interesting physics about it, the breathing and dive duration, the constant balancing whales are having to do with the energy they need to consume versus the energy they need to expend to get the energy they need to consume, and then this idea of external threats.
On top of everything, once you're down there eating, when you come back up, you could get hit by a cruise ship or a container ship, which is a very strong reality in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence.
And one important thing for us to just rephrase these and actually try to put labels on them and not just have them as whole sentences was that it makes the process much more nimble and quick when you actually work with these things. And you can really evaluate your concepts later on and say, does this address motion and mechanics instead of does this address insert paragraph, right? It really helps that.
And so content points were a key component. And the other thing, Ram came to us with these great, both specific but also open-ended things determined are these interactive goals. So going back to our framework, sort of these two key components had already gotten the seal of approval.
And the conversation where we were able to see what we had asked for being distilled and then reflected back to us gave us some confidence that, okay, we were on the right track together.
So the next component for us to figure out was this idea of everyone was on the same page about wanting a game. And the components we talked about, why a game, everyone was on board. But within that, the idea of something being a game is still kind of open-ended because...
What does game really mean, right? So this was an important question actually for us because I think especially in our space, in a cultural space, the word gamification has been thrown around a lot and it can mean so many things, but oftentimes the reality is that it can just mean that you put a high score on something and it means it's a game. And we didn't want to do that necessarily. There are a lot of different aspects to what games are, and in order for us to move forward and actually have a critical sort of analysis of the landscape, we did a bunch of research, and this is coming from backgrounds that people had with already just playing a lot of games or developing games on the sides, listening to podcasts, reading articles. So this wasn't necessarily a process that we just did for this project, but already sort of a knowledge base that everyone had acquired. So what we did was we did a lateral exploration of what kind of game frameworks and game mechanisms are out there that could benefit this experience. And what we did then was then group them into 3 different buckets so that we could have a choice between what works about these and what doesn't. And the first one here was what we call tap to dive, and it was sort of this on-rails experience where you got to have a little bit more of an action-based interaction and have a challenge and get a little bit of the intensity of what the whale goes through during that dive pattern. And the next concept was focusing much more on the design aspect of learning content and then applying it critically. So this was called build and learn, where you would essentially assemble your own whale. And these were all just very rough ideas, so don't judge them yet. But the idea here was, again, that you acquire this knowledge in the exhibit and then try to apply it critically in this interactive experience by assembling your own whale and then seeing how it performs and understanding what the parameters are that make for a good blue whale, essentially. The third one was much more narrative-driven. So we were trying to find a concept that would allow us to really put in as many content points as possible and have as much control over the narrative as we could. So this one would have dramatic moments where you need to make a choice and are faced with similar moments and choices that a whale might face while they're diving and trying to survive in their daily lives. What we did then was we took each concept and plain out just mapped them against the key content points. And this was, again, a very sort of rough exercise, but it did help us get an understanding of what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of each of these concepts. And what you can see is that each one of them sort of has a different spectrum there. And tap to dive was good in a lot of the aspects that would allow you to control the whale, whereas the build and learn really focused on the morphology and adaptations because that's what you're playing with. And the quick react, like I said, would cover the most content points. And if you look at it on paper, C, quick react, would actually be the one that we should choose, right? Because rationally, it checks off all the boxes. It does really well with all the content points. We can really have control over the narrative. But what we needed to ask ourselves, and that's something that we did with the ROM team collaboratively, was what is actually important about a game? Why is this a game, and why do we want to do this? And why is it not, for example, a video or just a piece of text? And the main idea was really, it should be fun, right? So a game should kind of trick you into learning things, and by doing that, it will engage you and actually draw you in and interact with the experience, and then you walk out and surprise you actually learn something. That's the ideal outcome of this. So the ultimate question was, how do you learn, and not necessarily what do you learn? And that's why we actually went with the tap to dive concept, even though we already knew at this point, and this is something that we were trying to be as open as possible in this phase, is that it might not address all of the content points. And like Dave was saying earlier, that was a tough thing to actually make that sacrifice in that point, because there were stakeholders in the room and scientists that they're very, very passionate about the things that this exhibit needed to achieve, and this particular piece in the exhibit also needed to achieve. But I think that's, Dave, that's something that you can speak to a little bit about the process where you already had this whole broad spectrum of pieces in the gallery that might be able to absorb that.
So what gave me confidence to proceed with this choice, and I knew I was in a room of others, some of the more traditional members of the team that really felt that, no, you've done this analysis, look over there, that's the one we should be going with.
Very scientific analysis.
And then we had our multimedia producer, Zach Rogers, who said, oh man, fine, we'll do that, but it's got to be fun. For a number of years around the ROM, I had a boss who said, you know what, fun is the F word at the ROM. But couldn't you just make sure we're having some fun in the stuff that you do? And so that was the struggle. And so I satisfied myself with the fact that we did have a room full of other things. We could move any content point off of this game. We didn't need to burden the game with absolutely everything you needed to learn about even the diving or eating bit, because we had other components that could take care of that. And the fact that I kept thinking, you know, this could be like a pop-up video. Like I can imagine little facts are going to show up and tell you all those things we really want you to learn. And you'll see in the end, of course, there are some at the end.
Yes.
But this is the key, going back to sort of the theme of institutional bravery. And this is something we really commend the ROM team for, with, in addition, having done that legwork before engaging us as a vendor about what these more abstract key components were so important at sort of critical moments like this, where it allowed the team to feel confident enough in those more abstract goals to go with the option here that probably, in court would not have held up as well as the third option. And it's those kind of leap of faith moments where there's that sort of those key stakes in the ground to go back to, was something that was really key in allowing the team that was on the ROM end of this to take risks that were sort of in best service of the experience.
You can talk about how we came out the other end at the end when we talk about measures of success, but we did, I think, over the course of the development of this, really understand, no, there is stealth learning going on here. You can be doing one thing, but something else is happening in your mind.
So back to our framework. Now we have game framework seal of approval. And then so the other thing, stepping to a parallel track momentarily, is that we were looking for, and it was really important for us to separate it into a parallel conversation, is what would the look and feel of this game be? We realized pretty early on that a lot of the references we were throwing out just internally, even our internal team, were having trouble dissecting what was a visual component and what was an actual gameplay component. So we broke out this feeling about what it would look like and this sort of mood board and visual conversation to be very intentionally separate and parallel from the development of the game concept.
And this strategy is something that we were doing as well on the design side, and it completely independent in that means of working. But we have a new director, and this was the first major exhibition that we were working at under his hand. And we were really trying to find that place of how do we not alienate our very traditional adult audience? How do we bring in families and kids? How do we make sure it's still accurate, but not too childish, but still attractive for families? And so finding that place with look and feel for us was very, very important throughout the exhibit, and including this component.
Yeah, and we, like Dave was saying, we did this same exercise on our end because even within our studio, everyone had a different understanding of what a side-scrolling whale game would look like and what it would feel like.
Strong opinions.
Yeah, very. What helped us was just do a really wide, or provide a really wide gamut of what are different game aesthetics, or even just general aesthetics that we would like to see in this game, with the idea in mind that, you know, Dave was saying that there is sort of this wide spectrum of audiences that we're trying to cater to with this. So this is just a small selection of all of those visuals that we had. And in the end, what we were trying to balance was have something that's approachable. So we went with this illustrative style, but also at the same time speak to families and you know, seasoned veterans of the museum that wouldn't be scared off by a cutesy little whale that goes on an adventure, but still be engaging enough to feel warm and inviting.
And the illustrative style is something we discussed at our end, knowing that photo real would be the way to go if we really wanted to make clear what a blue whale actually looks like and all of the other things they encounter under the water. So something that wasn't 8-bit for those who are totally nostalgic about the earliest video games they'd ever played, and those are the parents that are bringing their kids to our museum these days. So we had them in mind as well. So this was really, for us, right down the middle. We would have just enough accuracy to the look and feel, and that kind of fun, flat graphics at the same time.
So again, parallel conversation, we had the look and feel into a good place. And the next component, and what was probably the most challenging component, is figuring out the constraints, which is really the game logic. And it was challenging, but where there's a whale, there's a way. So a key thing for us early on, even internally, is what we often do is we start by doing a lot of brainstorming and throwing out ideas and precedent references. And it became pretty clear early on that what we were all contributing to sort of this central pot of ideas was actually a lot of different components. So there were all of these different gameplay aspects that people were discussing that influenced the way they were thinking about the game. And so we realized pretty early that we need to sort of take these assumptions and sort them into what felt like the core game features versus what were additional features, sort of the need to have versus the nice to have. And that was a really key thing for us to do. So the first thing we did with that is we took all of the different gameplay elements that we had kind of thrown out there and we put them on index cards, of which this is a beautiful reproduction. And we went through and we played through the game. It's what I affectionately call LARPing, which is where we would take it and someone would play the role of the whale, someone would be sort of some interface details, and we went through it over and over and over. Typically for us, we make the person who's the most confused be the person who's the most central to the action, which was typically me. So go ahead.
And this was incredibly important because at this point, one thing that we're not showing is we actually had a lot of the screens and a lot of the stages of the game designed. And we just hit a point where even within our team, again, internally, there were just so many different ideas of what this game can be and what all the details are, that the only way for us to actually make progress quickly and nimbly without designing this whole thing based on assumptions was to play it out. And like Joni was hinting at, this was a very exhausting process. This probably took about 4 hours, 5 hours of playing the same thing over and over again, and always iterating and talking out loud and stating very intentionally what the rules are. And those would be things like, okay, we have 3 breaths. Why do you have 3 breaths? And how deep can you dive? And so on.
And I'd like to interject at this point to talk about the fact that we hired an outside provider and left these kind of aspects up to them. We have a long history of hiring vendors and being fairly prescriptive. So you can imagine teams who aren't experienced in doing this kind of thing sitting around and trying to say, no, they ought to be doing this next. But what if this happened? And so we've learned that we can leave that to the experts, and that there's also this kind of creative thing that can go on among us as partners, that it is better to set the general outcomes in the acquisition process and then leave what it actually ends up being like to this messy process.
Yeah, and being able to have that flexibility beyond sort of the things we had decided as a group, we didn't have a lot of strong constraints in this kind of messy jumble of a process from the ROM, which was really important for us to have the flexibility to really constantly be asking ourselves if within this low fidelity playthrough things made sense and were working. So this is just a snapshot of the board at the end of the grueling session. And we'll get into more kind of the blue cards later, but essentially what we had done is built out and documented what to us felt like the key components of the game. So for these key components, if any of them were removed, the game logic and sort of the general playthrough would fall apart. Versus these extra elements where if those were added, they would be great, but if you removed them, it wouldn't cause the game to kind of break down. And we also did a pretty low fidelity prototype of the game interaction.
Yeah, and the reason for us doing this at this point of the phase of this project was that there are some aspects that even through static designs or role-playing, you just can't really figure out unless you actually prototype them. And this for us was a really helpful tool because we were still having questions about, does it actually make sense to control a blue whale with arcade buttons? Or does it come across in 2D, two-dimensional space when we try to show how a blue whale actually feeds and dives and eats for krill? So the goal of the prototype was really figuring out, are those things intuitive? Will people understand them? And in the end, it was also a tool for us to explain it to ourselves and to the stakeholders later in the room that, hey, this whole thing will actually work out. Believe us, even though this thing is just on paper right now, here's a little preview of what this might look like. And we kept this intentionally dirty and very messy. And we actually, at some point, I asked our developer to add these outlines to the whale just to make it clear that this is just a prototype and this is just a demonstration, not any hint of the final quality.
So we put our prototype on an iPad and we packed up all our cards and we went to Canada. So we had done all of this meeting up until now virtually, and it was really a point where doing an in-person workshop was definitely it was that crucial moment. And the really key part, which we give huge shout outs to the ROM for, is the people who were in that room for that workshop. And so Dave can talk about that more specifically, but we can't emphasize how kind of special of a treat it was to have this group together in person, and what a difference it made to the final product.
So if you imagine up to this point doing virtual meetings with screen sharing, so it was pretty natural and feeling like we were having meetings together, but that element of face-to-face, particularly at a point where you have to have real trust that you're going to move forward and get the product that you had envisioned, was key for us. And so Mark Engstrom, who was the senior curator on the team, was also the acting director at the time that the whales were died and that he went out and did this recovery process. So a very senior level staffer. And then a whole set of curators, each with an area of specialty. Burton there on the upper left is actually a bat curator, but he is one of the mammalogists. And Jackie, who is the anatomist. Zach, you see there in the middle behind the 3D printed whale skeleton in the upper middle shot there was our multimedia producer, Oliver, who was the DNA guy. He's actually a bird guy, but he does all of our DNA sequencing. And then others on the team that really had their own individual area that really concerned them. And so imagine you're at a point where everybody thinks they know what this product is going to be, but it's still individually pictured. And not a lot of time left. This whole idea of going out and getting somebody to finish the job for us was done very late. And so this was very crucial that we would somehow end up on the same page. So this was a landmark meeting to put these people in the room.
And this is typically where, when we're used to coming in as an outside vendor, this is typically where it's what is usually called kind of a digital working group or a digital team, which can, for a lot of projects, can work perfectly well and gets the job done. The difference is with this type of prototyping and in-person sessions, there's something lost every sort of third to fourth, fifth degree reporting that it is. And especially with a concept that's arguably more risky and playful and different, having the people who will approve the concept themselves in the room, the importance of that can't be understated.
And to be able to include a senior manager so that we didn't have to kind of make all of our decisions and then take it up the ladder and then come back down with input. It was all accomplished within the bounds of the meeting.
So within this meeting, so you can see this is, we did exactly what we had done in our studio, a little bit more succinctly and streamlined. So we played through the game, and the first part of the meeting was walking the whole ROM team through it and getting everyone in the room to understand what we had determined to be the core gameplay aspects. The photos on the right are for a second interactive we were doing for the exhibit, so not immediately relevant to the game, but it just shows like how low fidelity our prototypes can be and how helpful that is. So this is obviously a whale made out of tape. So again, low fidelity, important. So once we had gone through and gotten the core gameplay components in alignment with everyone and everyone understood that and was ready to go, we moved into talking about this bucket of things that we had determined the nice to haves or the extras.
And so what you see here is we were presented by Blue Cadet with this point system. And it had to do with their resources and in their sort of quality and time management equation, getting the job done. And so we were given how much? 7 points to spend?
7 points.
7 points.
Collectively in the room. And it wasn't like each person got to spend 7 points. No,
7 points total.
we had to collaborate and come to some kind of consensus about how to spend the 7 points across all the things we knew each individual wanted. So I'm just going to point a few out. So, for example, the morphology animation is something that would help us get inside the whale and see what truly is going on inside the whale. And we know how important that was. That was really what was driving this right from the beginning. And to do something like that, it was a pretty big spend. We wouldn't be left with very many points if we decided to include that. And over there you see partial swarm consumption. So if you imagine the whale you're driving around on the screen doesn't quite hit the swarm of krill, it kind of grabs it by the edges. Does that give you partial points? As opposed to what happens if you're a little more accurate and you drive right through the swarm of krill. So, and that was really, really big for the conservation biologist on the team. And so, amazingly, each one was gone through, its merits were argued over in this order, starting from low points to high points. And surprisingly, the team came together really, really uniformly and quickly once they got to the last section there about the external surface threats. And everybody agreed, no, you really have to empathize with a whale. It comes up after eating and could die from pollution or icebergs, as it was in this case of ice flow trapping them. And so there we go. We'd spent 4 points, and so it was actually fairly rapid from there to go back and say, oh, which of the ones that are low point scores are we left to do? And even though these weren't things that we said would kill an effective game, actually, it had a lot to do with making it feel right and feel fun.
Yeah, and I think one thing to emphasize about this too is that this wasn't necessarily us trying to negotiate down features. It was really that we came with all these things from our brainstorms and the brainstorm that we had with the ROM team, and these were all things that everyone on the table was excited about. So everyone wanted to have these things. I particularly wanted to have LED lights blinking under the arcade buttons, and I don't think that feature made the cut, unfortunately. But I think this was really a positive exercise, and we wanted to get it in, but in order to get it in with the short amount of time that we had, we wanted to be transparent about this is how much we can do, and this is how much we can accomplish.
And then the other component, this went really well, and it was really sort of a joy to facilitate. I think Dave and the rest of the ROM team will attribute it to generally positive Canadian sensibilities. I think we would say it's definitely emblematic of a really positive and healthy culture that the ROM has in terms of their internal and how they work with each other and weigh things. I think a couple things that contributed to that is this idea of coming up with these abstract goals before getting into the nitty-gritty of the experience. And that is a really helpful kind of stake in the ground when going back for it. So when people would be arguing for something they really wanted, you could see the process of them saying it out loud and realizing that it actually wasn't in the best service of these goals that everyone had agreed on earlier. So that was really important. The other thing that was key here is something we often see as a vendor, and I'm sure people in this room are familiar with it, is that often we come in and are making an interactive that is sort of unfairly tasked with the burden of being the fun thing throughout the entire exhibit. And so because of it, it has to kind of carry weight of stuff that isn't really about what's in best service of that content or that experience. So to the ROM team's credit, this was by no means the only component of this exhibit that was intended to be fun and playful. It really was the governing tone of the whole thing. So these are just some other elements that Dave can speak to, but that really liberated this group and this experience to not have to carry weight that really wasn't in the best service of the goals of this component.
And you may be asking the bigger question, why are we making you cry at the beginning and then filling this thing with superficial jokes? We found that was the mood on the team. Here's a gang that went out there like a SWAT team and were up to blood and guts, up to their waists. And they came back with these kind of war stories, but then there was this levity. And we said, hey, if this works for us, if it helps us kind of mediate the fact that this is really sad, then maybe we can make that part of the emotional journey. And so we filled the thing with jokes. There was a touchable orca whale heart that was also plastinated, and we asked you to touch it gently, but please don't break its heart. There were jokes about whale poo. I mean, how whale poo is important to the health of the oceans was not an insignificant story, and we did a whole animation of whales pooing and so on, and something that our interpreter planner called in the label a poonami. There's a whole section on whale calls called Singing the Blues. The whale, we gave it the affectionate name of Blue. There's a whole thing about the food chain called Hello Krill World. And then a thing about whale teeth and the fact that blue whales are not toothed whales. Whales are divided into toothed, or the ones that have baleen, which is this kind of stringy stuff they use to filter the krill. And so that section was called Bluetooth. So this fun versus serious thing was something that allowed us, it was part of what allowed us to make these kind of choices. We said, you know what, we can move that stuff off into the exhibit. I just wanted to point out a couple of other features. The internet is full of these kind of not quite accurate references about whale physiology. They say that the size of a whale heart is the size of a small car. So we went to Mercedes and we said, can you give us a smart car we can put next to the heart in the show so people can judge for themselves, which they did. We were planning to have a hologram of the whale heart while it was still busy being plastinated because we knew it was going to be a few months into the exhibition before it showed up. We said, no, you know what? A car covered with like blood and stickers is enough, and we'll just put a picture of the heart in there. What you see on the upper right there is what I came to call the woolly whale, which was a interactive art, like a communal art experience with wooden pegs on the wall, and we were giving you little threads. It was actually about making a list of points about sustainable actions you can take in making good choices about keeping the oceans healthy and clean. But that was more stealth learning because it was really a thing where people just loved to create this whale. And we were openly worried about the fact that we would have to undo it every few weeks. In fact, we were undoing it every couple of days. And then we had teams at home watching hockey games and creating little new skeins of whale for people to put back together again. Anyway, the point being is that the game was just one thing among many things. And so making these hard choices at this stage was easier for that.
And now, Ben, I was going to take us through the build components of the game, which are sort of a key part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll breeze through this a little bit. But the point that we were at the project now was that we felt like, okay, we're well equipped with all of the ideas and the intentions that we want this to be. So really, it just came to making this game, which, there's a process for that. We built it using Unity. We whiteboarded every single feature out. We mapped them all against milestones and planned every single week out, and really put out all the boxes that we had to check. We worked with the design team and the ROM team to think about every single state the whale could be in. We tried to envision how it could look in this space, and we tried to replicate it. This was a part that we often try to do. So one thing about this being a quick project and the actual exhibit being in Canada and us being in New York, we had to kind of use the means that were local and necessary. And in this case, it was a tangerine box that made for a good arcade cabinet. At this point, we had built a game that as we thought, and we checked off all the boxes. We had the core gameplay, we had even some of the additional features, the visual style was there, we had the type of user interaction that we wanted. We thought, okay, we've really completed this, but there really was that one last key point about why is this a game, and that was the $1 question. Is it fun, actually? And this is a really, really important point in our process where this was more on the Blue Cadet vendor side at this point, where we already knew that when we build this and when we have all the boxes checked, there's still that one extra box that's always invisible and that's so hard to anticipate. And it's that question of, is it working versus is it doing its job? So when we asked ourselves that question and put it out in front of people, this was the answer. It was not really fun. But that was one thing that we kind of expected and anticipated. This was a very early build. And one thing that's really, really important here at this part of the process is to remain open and honest with yourself. You have to listen to feedback and, especially from people that are not related to the project, and really try to even out all the kinks and remove as many points of friction as you can. So what we did was blind user testing, and that can also sometimes be disheartening. You'll think about what's the best questionnaire and what are the best ways that you could get information out of people, and try to get sophisticated feedback, and then you'll get responses like no. And the water doesn't quite feel like water. But those are important things.
We hate putting something on the floor where we're saying the beta testing is the day we open. So despite the short timeline, we love to be able to at least do a little bit of this no matter what we're doing, so that we have some chance to fix it.
Absolutely. And so what we did, we went about and took that feedback and tried to address it in small ways, still having faith in our process. And this is kind of where often the rubber meets the road, and you just have to get with it. And in this point, really what you can do is just iterate, test, and play, and repeat. And an important point here to make is that oftentimes you could be at this point and start to panic or doubt your original concept, but really you have to keep faith in it and really stick to it. And I think that's something that we can also laud the client for, where they saw some of the early concepts, but actually having gone through this whole process and knowing that we understand what the actual goal is of this experience, they knew that this was something that we could still accomplish. So we started to make some adjustments, and these were some of the ones where it went a little wrong.
This is the blooper reel.
Yes. We have the vacuum whale in the bottom left and the krill whale in the top right.
And there are things we knew about, like, well, it doesn't actually bend that way, and so don't make it bend so much that way.
Yeah. So we took all that feedback, and sure enough, after enough iteration, things actually started to become fun. And the point where we knew it was when people wanted to go home after work, and we had the tangerine box right at the door, and they would just try to squeeze that one last session in of the game. And people started to get really competitive about the high scores. And we only have shots of our team in here, but we actually sent these builds to the ROM team.
We had our own team with their own deadlines of other stuff they ought to have been working on at the time. And they're sharing tips and tricks for beating the high score and lauding it over each other.
And this was the final result. So the whole game experience, you're controlling this blue whale, and you have arcade buttons to move it up or down. And what you're seeing here is all of these things that the whale is doing. All of this is based on discussions and decisions, and has a history of both teams coming together and setting their own priorities. And everything you see here, the way that the whale bends, the way that it feeds, that larger krill swarms are towards the bottom, and I think we actually got the partial krill swarm consumption in there. And the fact that here now you have to manage your oxygen and you're running out and you're kind of risking that you could run out. All of these aspects in this game were based on this long process and this long journey, and we tried to squeeze in as many sort of hidden learning goals as possible.
And we're hitting time, but we're going to keep going for a few minutes just to talk about some of the key components, which are the takeaways.
So here you see some of our own staff. Actually, hard to tear them away from playing the game. On the left, when we finally opened, and then on the right, you're watching a family and others in the actual gameplay. Now, we have a formal research group at the ROM, but we didn't task them with finding out whether or not this one was working. It was clearly very popular. It was very popular on social. We could really follow the thread and see that people were energized by this. We had, I remember one from some mother saying, my husband and our kid were at it for a long, long time when I wanted to get through the exhibit, but she said, at least it was educational. And we wore out the console several times, and so that was a good indicator for us. And there were many, many lineups during our peak periods for this component as compared with the others. And the other thing we did is we kind of hung around and listened to what people were saying. And it's actually close to what we do, and we do a certain kind of visitor experience testing or ethnographic kind of testing. But this was just overhearing what visitors were saying while they were playing the game. And it was really, really heartening to us that what we were hearing were the learning outcomes. So they're having fun, but they're talking about the points that we intended to get across. And this for us was really, really the thing. And particularly for Mark, who was really dubious about a thing like a game in the exhibit, taking away from more what he might refer to as authentic object-based experiences. And appreciating that we found a way to get out the other end of a process and have people learning the things we wanted them to learn. And you'll notice that the morphology of what goes on the side of the whale is not in the game in the end. And we decided to move that to other kinds of text and graphics in another part of the exhibit. And you know whales don't breach, well, blue whales don't breach. But this one did.
All right, thank you.
And we're at time, so we won't do formal questions, but we'll hang out for a couple minutes if people have questions they want to come ask. Thank you, everyone.